The only life I've ever known is one of privilege and fortune when I compare to what my mother had to get in the same spot as I. Because of her, I was able to grow up in a safe neighborhood, never worry about money, and live my life how I wanted, and eventually follow my dreams here at Montclair. She wasn't given any of these things, but rather she had to fight for each opportunity since she grew up surrounded by uncertainty and fear, worried every day if she had enough money for the next day and be forced to live a life she didn't want.
I am also very privileged. I grew up with a great family and lots of stability. When I think of the sacrifices my grandparents made to come to New Jersey, it's just a surreal thought. I live a life of surplus, as I collect many things such as books and clothing. And when I think of what my grandparents were doing at my age, they were surviving Soviet communism with not much money or stability in their lives until they immigrated to the U.S.
After World War II, the Soviet Union extended its influence over much of Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany were drawn behind what is famously called the Iron Curtain. Even though each country had its own unique culture and traditions, they were forced into adopting the Soviets' model of governance. The result was decades of political repression, economic hardship, and the ever-growing frustration of regular people who felt trapped by a system they had no power to change.
In Hungary, the 1956 revolution was a tipping point. Between October and November 1956, sparked by calls for reform and independence from Soviet control, Hungarians rose up in a nationwide revolution. Workers, students, and even soldiers demanded free elections and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. For a moment, it seemed possible, as the government promised reforms and Soviet forces pulled back. But weeks later, tanks rolled into the capital Budapest, Hungary, crushing the uprising with enormous violence. 2,500 to 3,000 were killed, and around 200,000 fled the country as refugees. The revolution became a lasting symbol of the dangers and costs of communism and Soviet rule.
Soviet rule kept Eastern Europe controlled, silenced, and limited through violence. It led our families to rely only on two options: stay and suffer, or emigrate to America in pursuit of a better life, and maybe even accomplish something called the American Dream, where anybody from anywhere could come to America and make a life for themselves, far greater than the life they had originally, usually coming from a war-torn country and violent nation, for a peaceful life in the suburbs. For my mom, the decision came in her early 20s. She had watched her parents and grandparents work endlessly on their farm in Poland, only to have prices dictated by the government and opportunities cut short. She saw family members silenced for speaking out and neighbors leaving every year with no promise of return. There was no work for her in Poland, so she traveled to Sweden to work at a pizzeria. She worked at an ice cream and grocery store in West Germany, and she picked flowers and berries in Switzerland. None of these countries are in Eastern Europe. Staying meant living in a place where her future had already been decided, and leaving meant risking everything: her language, her culture, and her family, but it also meant she could finally choose her own path.
For my grandparents in Hungary, the choice was similar. After the revolution of 1956 was crushed, soldiers patrolled the streets and fear stayed in every home. Staying meant raising children under surveillance with little freedom and no security. Leaving meant taking what little they could carry and stepping into the unknown, not knowing if they'd ever see their family or home again. The weight of these choices still remains today. To leave meant breaking ties with everything familiar, carrying the grief of home and the fear of starting over. To stay meant surrendering freedom, silencing dreams, and living under the shadow of communism. Our families chose to walk away from the known into the unknown, and by doing so, they gave not only a future, but also hope.
Yet, in modern America, immigration has become one of the most polarizing issues of our time. In the 21st century, debates over border security, asylum policies, and various programs like DACA dominate the political landscape. Immigrants are often reduced to talking points and labeled as burdens, threats, or statistics, and not being recognized as individuals with stories as unique as ours. The current politicalization of immigration means that decisions about real lives are being framed as battles over ideology. For us, this topic is deeply personal. For example, if America had closed its doors between the 1950s or 1990s, our families would have never entered. The chance to rebuild, to work, to study, and eventually to live the American dream would never exist. And by extension, we would not be here, sitting in classrooms here at Montclair, pursuing our futures. Behind every policy, there's a human cost. Families separated at the border, refugees waiting years for asylum, and immigrants carrying the same scars of sacrifice our own families had to endure. My mother arrived in the U.S. when she was 22 years old in 1996 with exactly $1,000 in her bank account. She worked restlessly, 7 days a week, 3 different jobs, just to survive in a country where there was nothing. After years of saving money and completing trade school, she was able to save enough to pay for business school, as she got accepted into a program where she received a degree and got a high-paying job. Ever since then, she has been able to live the American dream, as well as her own personal ones.
My grandfather went to Michigan State University after immigrating from Hungary to Canada and worked toward a PhD in microbiology, and wrote a thesis that we still have in our family to this day. He then moved to New Jersey, worked on cancer research, and raised 2 sons and a daughter. Also, my grandmother was a bank manager as well, showing that the American dream does come true, as they both came here, found jobs, raised a family, and put their children through college. All the while, they had to teach themselves English too. Immigrants are the heartbeat of progress. They bring new ideas, hard work, and culture that strengthens our communities and drive innovation. Without immigrants, we lose the spirit that keeps our nation growing.